In the remote outskirts of a small town in Idaho, where pine trees lined the winding roads and silence hung like fog in the morning air, lived the Miller family. To outsiders, they were barely known, just another quiet family tucked away in a large, aging house at the end of a gravel road. Frank Miller, a retired Army mechanic, and his wife Deborah, a former school librarian, kept to themselves. They had 2 children, Ethan, the older son by 2 years, and Emily, the daughter who rarely left the property. The siblings were always seen together, walking side by side through the overgrown garden or staring out from the attic window. Even as children, they had an unusual closeness. They didn't attend public school, didn't play with the neighborhood kids, and didn't participate in community events. Deborah insisted on homeschooling them, and Frank enforced a strict, almost military-style discipline at home. Over time, neighbors stopped trying to get to know them. There was an air about the Millers that discouraged conversation, something cold and unsettling. Whenever Frank spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless, and final. Deborah rarely smiled, and if she did, it never quite reached her eyes. But it was the children who stirred the most whispers. Emily, with her pale skin and long, dark hair, looked almost ghost-like. Ethan, tall and thin, always wore a hoodie, even in the summer heat. Their silence made them more noticeable. People in town would exchange glances when they passed by. There was something eerie about the way the siblings moved, like shadows echoing one another. They spoke little, but their eyes followed everything. For years, this strange bubble around the Millers remained intact. The town learned to ignore them. No one had any reason to interfere, until the day Frank and Deborah died in a late-night car crash. Their vehicle had swerved off a mountain road and tumbled into a ravine. The cause of the crash was never clearly determined. Some said it was brake failure. Others whispered darker theories. But what truly unsettled people wasn't how the parents died. It was what happened after. Following the funeral, which only a few distant relatives attended, Ethan and Emily returned to the house alone. They didn't seek help, didn't reach out to family. The curtains remained drawn, mail piled up, deliveries were left untouched. The siblings stopped appearing in town altogether. People began to worry, but no one wanted to be the one to knock on their door. Then came the sightings. A gas station clerk claimed he saw Ethan and Emily holding hands, whispering to each other like lovers. Another local reported seeing them late at night, walking through the woods, their faces barely visible under moonlight. These stories were dismissed as exaggerations at first, but the pattern was too strange to ignore. Something was deeply wrong in that house at the end of the road. No one could say what exactly. But whatever it was festering in silence, unseen, unchecked, and waiting to explode. Weeks passed after the tragic death of Frank and Deborah Miller. But life in the small town continued with the quiet hum of daily routines. However, the Millers' absence began to feel like a dark cloud hanging over the neighborhood. People started to notice that Ethan and Emily were never seen leaving the house. They no longer took walks down the road or visited the local store. Their once sparse interactions with the outside world were completely cut off. The air of mystery surrounding the siblings deepened. The whispers grew louder, but no one had the courage to check on them. It wasn't until a local shopkeeper, Tom, noticed something out of place that the first real alarm was raised. Tom had been running the small convenience store in town for decades, and over the years he'd become familiar with the Millers, though they rarely spoke to him. One afternoon, while he was stocking shelves, he saw Emily and Ethan come in, together, as they always did. Emily looked different somehow, disheveled and pale, her hair hanging loosely around her face. Ethan, usually quiet and reserved, was scanning the aisles with a look that made Tom uncomfortable. The siblings didn't purchase anything but lingered by the frozen food section for an unnaturally long time. When they finally left, they didn't say a word, but the strange tension between them was palpable. A few days later, Tom noticed something even more disturbing. As he was putting up a new shipment of canned goods, he saw through the window of the store that the siblings were walking along the road outside. What caught his attention was how close they were. Too close. Emily's hand brushed against Ethan's, but instead of pulling away, they lingered. It wasn't normal for siblings. Tom had seen plenty of families in his years behind the counter, and this behavior struck him as unnatural. But he didn't say anything to anyone. He thought it might just be his imagination. Still, the image of them together, in that odd closeness, stayed with him. A few days after that encounter, another person, Mary, a local woman who had worked as a nurse, came forward with a troubling story. She had been driving near the Miller house when she saw the siblings standing in the yard at dusk. Emily was sitting on a bench, and Ethan was pacing in front of her, as if deep in thought. Mary had lived in town for years and was no stranger to the Millers' peculiar ways. But something in the way Ethan was acting this time unsettled her. There was an intensity to his movements, his fists clenched, his posture rigid, that made her stop the car for a moment. When he turned to look at her, she quickly drove away, unsure of what she had seen, but feeling like something was very wrong. Within the next week, the Miller's house was abandoned. The yard, once neatly kept, became overgrown with weeds. The front porch lights never flickered on at night. Neighbors tried calling, but no one answered. Concerned, they began to ask around, but no one had seen either Emily or Ethan. A growing unease swept through the small town. Something wasn't right. One afternoon, a neighbor, feeling particularly anxious, decided to check the house for any signs of life. They found the front door unlocked, which was odd considering the family's previously meticulous habits. Inside, it was eerily still. Dust had begun to settle on the furniture, and a faint, musty smell lingered in the air. The house felt abandoned, except for the photographs that caught the neighbor's eye. They were old family portraits, but some of them seemed off. In the corner of one, Ethan and Emily were standing unusually close, their arms around each other in a way that seemed too intimate for siblings. The sight made the neighbor uneasy, but they said nothing. It felt like a boundary had been crossed, something hidden in plain sight. Days later, rumors started to circulate. Some said they had seen the siblings leave the town at night, driving away in a car. Others claimed to have heard strange noises coming from the house, but no one knew where they had gone. They had vanished without a trace, leaving nothing but a lingering sense of dread. The townspeople could only speculate. What had been happening in that house? What had they been hiding? The answers were still out there, but the truth, hidden, behind closed doors, was far darker than anyone could have imagined. The disappearance of Emily and Ethan Miller sent ripples through the town. The quiet, almost forgettable family had suddenly become the center of every conversation, with people speculating about what had happened behind those closed doors. For weeks, the police had no leads. No one had seen them leave the house, and there was no sign of a struggle or forced entry into the home. The siblings had simply vanished, like whispers on the wind. However, a breakthrough came when the local sheriff, Michael Williams, decided to check the old family cabin that the Millers had inherited from their grandfather, a secluded property, deep in the woods. The cabin was located about 20 miles outside town, hidden among dense trees and rolling hills. The Millers had always kept it a secret, only mentioning it sparingly to those who asked. It was a place that seemed to embody the isolation they preferred, far from prying eyes. No one had seen the cabin in years, and when Sheriff Williams arrived, he felt the eerie silence surrounding the place. The property looked abandoned, but the faint signs of recent activity caught his attention. Footprints leading up to the door, a faint trail in the snow, and a scattering of empty food cans near. The back of the cabin. Inside, the smell of old wood mixed with something far more unsettling, a sense of decay, both in the house and in the lives of those who had lived there. The walls were lined with old hunting trophies, dusty bookshelves, and personal mementos, but it was the basement door that drew Sheriff Williams's attention. It was locked, and the air around it felt thick with an unspoken tension. Despite the odd sense of foreboding, he pried open the door with the help of his deputies and descended into the basement. What they found there would haunt him for the rest of his career. The basement was cluttered with forgotten boxes, old furniture, and piles of discarded clothes. But beneath all that was something far more sinister, a small wooden chest recently disturbed. Sheriff Williams felt his heart race as he approached it, his flashlight flickering against the darkness. When he opened the chest, he found a stack of journals, all written in Emily's hand. They were filled with strange, unsettling accounts of her and Ethan's lives, accounts that seemed more like confessions than memories. The journals spoke of their isolated existence, of an intense, suffocating bond that had formed between them over the years. Emily wrote of her growing sense of confusion, of feelings that went beyond the normal love a sister should have for her brother. She described a growing dependency, an obsession that had crept into their relationship over time. Ethan, according to her, had become possessive and controlling, afraid that she might leave him. The journal entries described a gradual shift from a close but normal sibling relationship to something darker, more dangerous. There were mentions of fights, jealousy, and emotional manipulation. And then, the chilling words, "He's the only person who understands me. If I leave him, I'll have nothing." The last few entries were the most troubling. They detailed how their relationship had shifted to the point where Ethan had begun to threaten Emily, accusing her of betraying him when she spoke to others, even about trivial matters. Emily wrote that she had begun to fear Ethan, that his anger was unpredictable and violent. But there was no escape. In the last entry, Emily confessed to feeling trapped, cornered, with nowhere to go but deeper into the relationship. "We are all we have left," she wrote, "and I can't live without him. He won't let me." As the sheriff and his team dug deeper into the cabin, they found more unsettling signs of their time there. Empty bottles of medication, scattered around the rooms, hinted at the fragile mental state of both siblings. They were barely surviving in isolation, their minds and emotions becoming more entangled by the day. The disturbing discovery pointed to a pattern of extreme psychological manipulation and isolation that had festered between the siblings for years. But nothing could have prepared the sheriff for what came next. Behind the cabin, partially buried in the frozen earth, a freshly dug grave awaited. Its shallow depth indicated it had been disturbed only recently. Sheriff Williams ordered the area to be excavated, and within minutes, the remains of a body were uncovered. The body was male, identified through dental records as Ethan Miller. He had been brutally stabbed multiple times, his body left in the dirt like a discarded object. His face, frozen in a look of terror, told a story of final moments spent in agony, The chilling realization set in. Ethan Miller was dead, and Emily was nowhere to be found. The search for Emily intensified. The town's residents began to fear the worst. But there was still a shred of hope. Where had Emily gone? Had she fled, driven by guilt, fear, or something else? And if she was still out there, what had driven her to commit such an act? The sheriff could feel it in his gut. There was something far darker lurking beneath the surface of this case, something that had yet to fully reveal itself. The truth was closer than anyone realized, and it was far more twisted than anyone could have imagined. The search for Emily Miller grew more desperate as days turned into weeks. The town was engulfed in a sense of unease, as if a dark presence had descended upon the community. Despite their best efforts, law enforcement officials could find no trace of her. The dense forests around the cabin were combed through, the small town's streets were scoured, and even nearby towns were alerted. But Emily was gone, vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but a trail of confusion and suspicion. Then, one cold morning, a breakthrough came from a hiker who stumbled upon an old ranger station deep in the woods. The station had long been abandoned, but it was the only other structure in the area besides the Miller cabin. The hiker had noticed a faint glow coming from inside, despite the building's dilapidated state. Thinking it was just an animal or perhaps some other lost soul, the hiker cautiously approached. As they got closer, they realized that the station was far from empty. Inside, Emily Miller lay unconscious, curled in a corner near the broken wood stove. When Emily was found, she was in a state of shock, barely able to comprehend her surroundings. She was taken to the hospital immediately, where she was treated for hypothermia and dehydration. Despite her physical recovery, her mental state was fragile, and it would take hours of gentle questioning before law enforcement could get any answers. The first thing Emily said when she regained consciousness was, "He's gone. I didn't mean for it to happen." Her voice was quiet, trembling with fear and exhaustion. The officers surrounding her knew they had to proceed carefully. They didn't push her for details, but one thing was clear. Emily was traumatized, and whatever had happened between her and her brother had broken her in ways no one fully understood. Over the next few days, Emily was kept in isolation as authorities pieced together the story she was too afraid to tell. When she finally spoke in full, her account painted a chilling picture of life with Ethan after the death of their parents. According to Emily, the relationship between her and her brother had become increasingly toxic and manipulative. Ethan had become more controlling, isolating her from any outside contact, and convincing her that they were all they had left in the world. He had turned the house into a prison, and the cabin, once a retreat, had become a place of darkness, a sanctuary where he could keep her to himself. Emily confessed that her fear of Ethan had grown unbearable. He had started to threaten her, using violence to intimidate her into submission. She described how Ethan would accuse her of betraying him whenever she spoke to anyone, even in passing. His outbursts were unpredictable, his anger overwhelming. But Emily had no escape. She had been trapped, cornered by the very person who should have been her protector. But it was not just fear that kept her there. It was a twisted sense of attachment. She had begun to believe that she needed him, that without him, she would be nothing. It wasn't until the night of the murder that Emily finally snapped. Ethan had threatened her once again, accusing her of planning to leave him. He was enraged, pacing around the cabin, his anger building to a dangerous crescendo. Emily, frightened and exhausted, had tried to reason with him, but the confrontation quickly escalated. Ethan became violent, shoving her to the floor and screaming at her to stay with him, to never leave him. In the chaos, Emily grabbed a kitchen knife, one of the few items she could reach, and in a desperate act of self-defense, she stabbed him. As Ethan collapsed, Emily stood over him, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't meant to kill him. She just wanted to stop the violence. But it was too late. Ethan was dead. After the murder, Emily fled into the night, terrified of what she had done. She had no plan, no idea where to go. She only knew that she couldn't stay in the cabin, not with Ethan's body lying in the next room. She wandered through the wilderness, lost and alone, until she had found the ranger station, a place she had once visited with her father when she was younger. It was there, in the solitude of the woods, that she had collapsed in exhaustion, unable to continue, running from the truth. Her confession was heartbreaking, but it also raised more questions than answers. Had Emily acted in self-defense, or had the years of psychological manipulation pushed her to the point of no return? The law was not quick to dismiss her actions, but there was a sense that Emily had been a victim in her own right, trapped in a twisted reality she couldn't escape. As she was led away in handcuffs, the town couldn't help but wonder, how could such a horrific act happen in a family that, on the surface, seemed so ordinary? The truth, however painful, was out now. But it was clear that this was only the beginning of the story, a story that would haunt the town for years to come. As Emily Miller stood before the judge, her eyes vacant and her hands trembling, the weight of what she had done seemed to finally settle in. The courtroom was packed with people from the small town, all of them eager to understand what had driven Emily to kill her brother. Some saw her as a victim, a young woman trapped in a toxic relationship. Others saw a cold-blooded killer, someone who had crossed a line that could never be undone. The jury listened intently as the prosecutor laid out the case, painting Ethan as a victim of his sister's betrayal. But in Emily's eyes, it wasn't that simple. Emily had never fully understood the depth of her brother's obsession with her until after he was gone. Throughout the trial, she spoke little, only answering questions when absolutely necessary. Her mind was elsewhere, reliving the years of isolation, manipulation, and fear that had defined her existence with Ethan. She had been trapped in a twisted, suffocating bond that was hard for anyone outside their family to comprehend. The small town, known for its tight-knit community, had its own ideas about the Millers, but nothing prepared them for the truth that Emily's actions had unveiled. Her defense lawyer tried to convince the jury that Emily had acted in self-defense, that the years of emotional and psychological abuse from Ethan had left her with no choice but to protect herself. The prosecutor, however, painted a different picture. They argued that Emily's decision to take her brother's life wasn't out of necessity, but rather a result of a deep-seated resentment and jealousy that had grown between them over time. The prosecution claimed that Emily had manipulated Ethan just as much as he had manipulated her, and that her decision to murder him was a calculated act, not a desperate attempt to defend herself. The case turned the town upside down. People who had once sympathized with Emily were now torn. Some said she was a victim of circumstance, a girl who had lived in a world that no one else understood. Others said that she had crossed a line, and no amount of history could justify the murder of her own flesh and blood. The media descended on the town, eager to cover the sensational story of a sister killing her brother in cold blood, leaving the townspeople to grapple with their own conflicting emotions. Days stretched into weeks as the trial continued. But, in the end, the jury deliberated and returned with a verdict: guilty of manslaughter. The charge wasn't as severe as murder, but it still carried a significant sentence. Emily was sentenced to 10 years in prison, though the judge acknowledged the unique circumstances of her case. She was not entirely to blame for the horrific events that had unfolded. But the truth remained undeniable. Ethan Miller was dead, and nothing could bring him back. After the sentencing, Emily was escorted out of the courtroom, her eyes still blank, as if the gravity of the situation hadn't fully reached her. She would spend the next several years in prison, but even as she entered the holding cell, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Something inside her had been broken, and no amount of time behind bars would ever mend the fractures in her soul. She was alone now, completely alone, with nothing left but the ghosts of the life she had shared with her brother. In the town, life slowly began to return to normal. People went back to their routines, the memory of the Millers fading into the backdrop of everyday life. But there was an undeniable shift in the air, a sense of loss, a sense of brokenness. The Millers had been a family once, but their story was one of decay, isolation, and tragedy. The town would never be the same, not after the dark secrets of the Miller family had been exposed. As for Emily, she was left to confront the haunting reality of her actions. The years she had spent in that isolated world, the bond she had shared with her brother, were now nothing but shadows in her mind. The question of whether she had acted out of self-defense or something more sinister would linger in her heart for the rest of her life. But one thing was certain: she would never escape the consequences of the twisted relationship that had destroyed everything. The ghosts of her past would follow her wherever she went, and the scars would never fade.